As I said last time, things are going fairly good for a lot of people, but I do suggest you start looking at your total grade so you can start making decisions. Those of you who are athletes who have given me a sheet, I've gotten all the ones I had before today done. The ones that were given to me today, I'll try and have those done today. I will email them to your coaches so you don't have to come pick anything up. They'll just get a copy of it, and that way, they can do what they want, and you don't have to do any more running around. That said, I kept you guys a little bit over last time, and so today I'm going to keep you under. We're only going to really cover one more major. Yeah, I know. It's a great day, isn't it? Yeah, doing what I can, man. Doing what I can. And so really it's the review of this one that's going to make up the big portion of it. And that's because we covered so much information last time. Almost an impossible amount of information. But as I said, in my belief, this is the toughest section we're going to cover, is when we enter the modern period. And so that said, the plots of this movement often find a protagonist in search of identity. The plots of this movement often find a protagonist in search for identity. In many ways, it is a reaction to the industrial age. It was a German movement. Expressionism. Now, though it was a German movement, the example I gave you was of an American playwright. Who was that playwright? Eugene O'Neill. In the play? The Hairy Ape. What did I say about Eugene O'Neill? Yes. The most awarded playwright in U.S. history. You name it, that guy has the trophy for it. He is the person who racked them up. And for him to write an expressionistic play was simply him stretching. You name it, he experimented in it, he tried to create something with it. In this movement, we see things we recognize, but we see them in ways we don't normally perceive them. What? Yes, surrealism. So it has the elements of realism, and then something is out of order with it. Now, surrealism, as I said, was most successful in the visual arts. And who did I say was probably the best at it? Salvador Dali. The persistence of memory being that great example that everybody has seen before, but nobody realized, okay, who did this or what it is. But Salvador Dali. Now, surrealism is a French movement, and as I said before, when in doubt, you can probably pick France, and you'll be right half the time. It is in France we find an individual attempting to join this movement and getting tossed out of it, and that was Artaud. Antoine Artaud. Now, it's Artaud who I call theater's greatest bad artist. And it's because his artistic endeavors failed, constantly. What is his reputation based on? Why do we know him? Artaud's Theater of Cruelty. Artaud's Theater of Cruelty. And what was the cruelty to it? What was he trying to accomplish, folks? It's been a long time going over this one. took a lot of time detailing, his aspirations. He wanted the audience to have a catharsis, an awakening. What was cruel about it is that his, purpose was to try and have the audience see who they actually were, to get rid of the veneer. And so it is not an easy thing to define, but I gave you a very concise definition for it. And so it should not be a mystery with that one. Artaud's theater of cruelty was found in his masterwork. Finally got published while he was sitting in an asylum. Artaud's book. Well, then I suggest you write down what book was by Artaud, so you can look that one up. Because I promise you, you will revisit that one. In fact, that was one of the questions on Crash Course for you. And so I'm revisiting it and finding that, maybe I should keep revisiting this. What was the first of these non-realistic movements? Symbolism. Symbolism doesn't have a lot of staying power. It does have a lot of influence. But the main reason that we always talk about it, it was easily the first movement that tried to break away from realism. It was the first step that said, hey, there's more than what we can see in life. We don't understand people's motivations. There's only so much you can tell with realism. We want to say more, and so symbolism starts to emerge. Humans are condemned to free will. We are all condemned to free will. The only good and evil is what we do. One of the most quoted individuals of this movement was Nietzsche. Existentialism. Existentialism. We are all condemned to free will. The playwright I highlighted, one of the main philosophers of it, there were two individuals associated with this movement. Sartre, Camus. Sartre and Camus. Which was the most famous playwright? Sartre. What was Camus famous for? He was the novelist. He wrote The Stranger, Le Stranger. And so Camus, is actually a very important figure, but when it came to playwriting, it is Sartre. His masterpiece was No Exit. No Exit was his masterpiece in existentialism. Now, from Camus, we get this movement that begins to grow out of it, absurdism. But what do we call absurdism in English? The absurdist fell under what category for the theater? Theater of the absurd. It's the only ism that has a title to it when it refers to the theater. Both existentialism and théâtre de l'absurde, theater of the absurd, were out of France. Both were out of France. One of the ironies, though, is that the two most important figures for theater of the absurd, neither of them spoke French as their native language. French was their second language. And so the first to have a success on stage in Theater of the Absurd was Ionesco, Eugene Ionesco. His Chairs was the first one that was successful, though his great work was Bald Soprano. I'll always advocate for Rhinoceros, but Bald Soprano is that show that always shows up. You can travel all over the world and somebody's doing a production of the Bald Soprano. It just happens to be that show. And then the second individual was Samuel Beckett. Where was Eugene Ionesco from? Romania. And Beckett? Ireland. Samuel Beckett is a continuation of a long line of Irish playwrights. In fact, the only new material we'll cover today is an Irish playwright, but George Bernard Shaw, Martin McDonagh, Keane, all of them were writing plays. There's a lot of individuals who come out of Ireland who write very important plays in our genre. And so Samuel Beckett is considered by many people to be the finest playwright of the 20th century, and his masterwork, Godot, Waiting for Godot. And so that is considered by many people to be the finest play of the 20th century. Most people put it in the same category as Hamlet. It is one of those most important plays that everybody should actually take a look at some point. This was the only movement to emerge from Italy. Futurism, the futurist. And they were big proponents for what philosophy? Technology, the mechanical at that time, equals enlightenment. And so you judged a society based on how advanced they had moved technologically. And so, they saw, a lot of, nations as being, sub to the Western nations that were, building railroads and starting to build cars and airplanes and everything else they thought should just be wiped away because it wasn't contributing. Not exactly the big rah-rah, but it was a very big movement. It was a very important movement in the beginning of filmmaking. Filmmaking was a technological art at the time. People were going gaga for it. And so, it really took off in a lot of places. A lot of good German work came out of it. If I opened a book and pointed, what movement am I participating in? Dadaism. Because Dadaism is based on chance. If there's any word that sums it up, it's chance. Who was the spokesman for Dadaism? Tristan Tzar. Now, he was Swiss, and Dadaism does have roots in Switzerland, but it's in France that Dadaism really comes into its own. That's where we take a look at it and go, yeah, this is where, things are going to happen. But Dadaism was the artistic movement, philosophy really, where, chance was the obstacle. It's believed strongly that Dadaism was actually civil. What does Dada mean? Well, they opened a book, they pointed, and the first word they pointed at would become the name of the movement. And so the first word was Dada. If you translate Dada into English, it's the equivalent of a baby stroller or a baby pram. And so, that's how they came up with their movement's name. It was, one of those things of like, okay, let's roll with it. And so the idea of trying to make everything by chance. The Good Woman of Szechuan is an example of what? Epic theater. What is epic theater? It does challenge that dream world dramatic illusion. It tries to break the illusion. It shows you how it's created. Its costumes aren't there to just be, oh, look, it's authentic. You can tell they're wearing costumes. You can tell they're wearing makeup. They don't blend it beautifully. You can tell it's a set piece. The flats are exposed. You can actually see how the rigging works in the show. Now, one thing I didn't dwell on last time, and I have to hit today, is this was actually a lot to do with Brecht's theory of alienation. And please get that, Brecht's theory of alienation, or just put alienation. Brecht's theory of alienation was the idea that if the audience went and saw a piece of theater where it was realism, illusionary, they get lost in the story. It's by constantly having them aware that they're watching a piece of theater, they can think about what the piece is and not get lost in a story. I like to say all the time that, no good show is too long and no bad show is too short. You can live through both of them. But in Brecht's idea, if you have that good show where people lose track of everything, they're so involved in it, then they're going to miss the point of what the story's trying to communicate. And so in many ways, it's an evolution of the problem play. But his theory of alienation was to never let the audience surrender themselves to a story. That's one of the reasons that when you look at his shows, he places them in distant times or way in foreign lands. Now remember, he's creating these shows where? Germany. Epic theater really is a German or Czech German movement for the most part. But Good Woman of Szechuan takes place where? Szechuan should give you a good hint. China. Why? So when the audience sits there, they don't see things they recognize and easily relate to. And so it furthers that alienation, the distancing. The Caucasian chalk circle, well, it occurs in Africa. Once again, to get people separated. His most important work, Mother Courage and Her Children, it takes place 500 years before. And so he puts it in the distant past. He does all these things trying to cause a separation where you're just watching and seeing the ideas. Now, Brecht's epic theater was highly political. Epic theater does not necessarily have to be political. It's just what Brecht was creating was political and pushing his agenda. There's nothing wrong with that. That's one of the many purposes of theater. Shaw was doing the same thing. Ibsen was doing the same thing. It just happens that as Brecht was doing it, we were going through some very turbulent times, and so some people still frown upon him, but some people, they really champion the guy. And so all of this takes us to the one movement I'm going to talk about today. And it was an English movement. It came in at the very end of the 19th century. And this movement was called Art for Art's Sake. S-A-K-E, sake. Art for Art's Sake. Now, Art for Art's Sake was a movement that looked like realism. Its presentation was realism. It tried to create an illusion, and it was the polar opposite of everything Brecht wanted. It did not want to send messages. It did not want to communicate ideas. Art for Art's Sake was interested in entertaining. So what made it non-realistic? Well, if you want to create a world where all coincidences fall your way, and just, if you're walking in a field, the guy next to you keeps stepping in crap, and you keep, finding money laying around, there you got Art for Art's Sake. One of their big things was, and I've always appreciated this, is that lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. Lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. What do I mean? And I would argue strongly that this is heavily present in today's world. The telling of beautiful, untrue things is the proper aim of art. But fiction doesn't have to be beautiful. To what? Social media. Once again, doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be beautiful. You've all seen a skincare commercial where they talk to you about how this is going to make your life so much better. And the actor they put in there looks like the last person who actually needs skincare. And you see it again and again and again. They're not going to find a person who looks like they're in desperate need of help. They're going to find somebody that shows, hey, this looks like somebody who will show beautiful results. That person may never use the stuff. But you know, when we see it, we see this ideal. Same thing when we see weight loss commercials all the time. Very rarely are they going to pull somebody out there who's topping 300 pounds to talk about, you know, I've just started this diet. Instead, they're going to tow someone out there who looks like, you know, oh, look, they have 7% body fat. You know, I'm glad to see that marathon runner really has that diet under control. Well, none of those things are really true to what we're telling you, but they're ideals. They're what we would want. They're what our desires have. Art for art's sake, believe that theater, that visual arts, that dance, all those things exist for pleasure, for enjoyment. One director said at a time that if I wanted to send a message, I'd use Western Union. They're not trying to do what Shaw did. They're not trying to do what Ibsen did. They're not trying to do anything that Brecht did. They're trying to get people in seats and have people have a good time. Which is no different than what melodrama was trying to do before. But the thing is, they're doing it with realism as far as the acting and all the look of it. And, you know, for the most part, the plots seem very normal until you look at all the coincidences that seem to just fall one after another. The artist that is mainly associated with this movement, and one of the most important artists of the late 19th century, was Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde. He was a poet, a novelist, and foremost a playwright. But what he was really known for in his lifetime is he was what they called a wit. W-I-T. In fact, people paid to see him speak like they paid to see Mark Twain speak at the time. It was a big deal. And so he was known as a wit. What does that mean? I could argue he was a professional wit to a certain extent. Basically, wits are experts at being a smartass. They are the person who constantly have a reply, something to say that's very clever, the constant comeback artist, you know, the person who can react at the drop of a hat to any situation and have a comment on it. And so people really enjoyed him because he was funny in his commentary about what was going on. You know, one interview he said, you know, quitting smoking was the easiest thing he ever did. You know, He quits dozens of times each day. He said that America was one of the only, he loved America because it was idealistic and decadent at the same time. He had so many things to comment on. It became famous as, he wrote in magazines and journals, and people were buying it up. But it's as an artist, not as a wit, that we still talk about him and remember him. In fact, he wrote one of the still most popular Gothic horror novels of that period. Anyone? A Picture of Dorian Gray is by Oscar Wilde. And it is still considered one of those, when you look at the genres, it is one of those top novels. In his lifetime, he tried writing verse theater, really poetic, didn't find much success with it. Where he really finds his footing and what we know him for is comedy. He took his wit and he wrote some of the greatest comedies of that period. He wrote one non-comedy, Salome. Anybody can tell me who Salome is in history? I'll give you a hint. It's biblical history. Salome. No, it's Solomon. Salome is the woman who requests that John the Baptist lose his head. And that play was promptly banned because of its religious themes. The British looked at it and were like, no. He only found an audience for it in France, where they didn't go nuts about it. But in England, they were like, no, this ain't going to happen. But his 4 comedies, he only wrote 4 comedies. His career got cut short, and we'll get to that. Each one gets better after the last. He actually, his first play he came up with, and then we find some of the same jokes in the second one that worked, and then we find some of the jokes that worked in that second one even more in the third one with the new stuff. And by the time he got to number 4, which is considered his masterpiece, he had really mastered this art. His most important work is The Importance of Being Earnest. The importance of being earnest. So how does this thing become non-realistic? Because we have children who are left in, babies actually left in handbags at train stations who, get adopted by families and then as adults run into their own family, out of the blue. They're best friends with their brother, but don't realize it's their brother until the end of the play. The person they're arguing with turns out to be their aunt, that they just thought was, a person that was, always causing them problems. Things happen in it that just can't happen. It's like modern soap operas. Oh my God, he's in a coma. When will he come out of it? Well, when we renegotiate his contract and get a better deal. But, that's what makes it non-realistic. But they're fun. They're just there for people to enjoy. That's the point to them. The Importance of Being Earnest was a hit, a huge hit. And then at the height of Wilde's popularity, at the antithesis of the fame of The Importance of Being Earnest, all of his plays were taken down in the West End. The West End is basically Broadway for London. His novels and poems were pulled out of stores, and basically he was erased. And so my question to you is, what happened? What happened to Mr. Wilde? Pull plays out of every theater, folks, is not a small action. That takes government. That actually takes power to do. That's not taste. That's not people saying, well, I don't like this show. All of his plays were being performed at some point at the same time. And then They weren't. Oscar Wilde was arrested for gross indecency. Yes, that is the name of the charge that they had in Britain, gross indecency. And so gross indecency was what? No. Not even in the ballpark. Gross indecency was the British charge for homosexuality. And so the fact that Oscar Wilde was a homosexual led to him being put on trial. Now, the trial was really going well for Oscar Wilde. Why? Because when they put him on the stand, everybody laughed all the way through his testimony. Why? Because he kept mocking the prosecution, turning their lines back against them. He was that wit, and it was one of those trials of the century. You know, it was one of those things that people were reading about in the papers. People kept trying to get seats in the gallery. You know, everybody wanted to see what was going on because it was the talk of London, and it became talk of the British Empire. And things seemed to be going well for Wilde, and then they started bringing in a parade of witnesses, and things started to get worse and worse for him. And in the end, he was convicted of gross indecency. Gross indecency would remain a crime in Britain all the way to the 1960s. In fact, you know, Alan Turing, the reason you all have computers and phones that are basically computers in your pocket, he was the person who first created the computer. He was convicted of gross indecency. You know, and gross indecency led to sentences of hard labor. You know, gross indecency was considered to be up there with murder as far as punishments were concerned. And so Oscar Wilde was sent away to prison and served hard labor for over a year. He was a gentleman, meaning, you know, this is a person who went to university and was writing his whole life. He wasn't, you know, working out every day. And so when they sent him to prison, it broke him physically. You know, it was literally one of those environments where he was making little rocks out of big rocks. And so when he got out of prison, he died within a year. And so much like Artaud, who gets out of the asylum and everybody realizes how great he is, everybody realized how great, you know, Wilde was. But because of his conviction under British law, he was not allowed to earn a living. You know, he could not profit from the sale of anything while away in prison. And so all of his stuff was shut down. Everything he had went away. And so that was the fate of Oscar Wilde. But Oscar Wilde is the man who is mostly associated with art for art's sake. In fact, it is a quote by him where he said, "Lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art." You know, he wasn't there trying to change the world. You know, he was there trying to entertain people. Picture of Dorian Gray is an entertaining novel. Nobody walks away from reading it and saying, "I'm going to change the world." You know, Brecht, Shaw, Ibsen, even Artaud, all wanted to change people, all wanted to rally people around, all wanted to get people, you know, things to move forward. Wilde wasn't interested in any of this. You know, he probably got real interested when they arrested him, but he wasn't interested in any of it before. One of the things I love about his plays is everybody seems to have money and nobody seems to have a job. And so all of his characters, you know, yes, I'm going to eat here and I'm going to go do this and I'm going to go do that. None of them are punching a clock. You know, they can do it 5 days, 6 days a week. You know, they always talk about how they owe money and they're always in debt and stuff like this, or they owe a creditor or something, but you never see them working to pay off anything. You know, most of his plays are about people trying to get married or people pursuing somebody. But in the end of the day, all of that went away overnight. It just got erased. And so, along with all of the theater of the absurd, existentialism, expressionism, all the others, there's also art for art's sake. And so get that one down. Folks, that's all I'm going to do today, is cover that one. I'm going to call roll. As I get through it, you'll get out of here.